Welcome to the Name Stories podcast, where we discuss issues related to our research into names and naming in adoption. So this morning, Hannah and myself are in conversation about the Names and Adoption project. So we're going to be talking about our experience of taking part and our experience of talking to participants. So just to kick off, first of all, about the project itself, Hannah, about the Names and Adoption project and your thoughts about taking part.
So I think we were both really excited to get started on this project, looking at adoption and names, and we talked to both adoptees and adopters, which has actually led to a very interesting project of getting very different perspectives from different groups of people on adoption and names, and lots of issues to do with adoption that we didn't sort of anticipate first looking at. So it's been a very varied project. We were aware this was going to be a sensitive project that we would have to handle very carefully with participants. But actually, we became really aware that this was even more sensitive and more complex than we even first imagined. So in the early stages, we had several adult adoptees and talked through the project, some concerns, some questions they had. And actually, their input was really essential in how we approach people, how we designed, how people were going to take part in the project. And so actually, from the concern of the adult adoptees, they actually helped to benefit the project and make it even more fulfilling for us and for other people who took part. So
Yeah, and I know at the beginning we did have some concerns because it was including adopters and adoptees. So it was good to look at that for ourselves, I think, wasn't it?
It was, and as well to question our own approach to it. And actually the adoptees in some ways questioned why we were including adopters, why it was not an adoptee-only project, and similarly the other way round. But actually, as the project's gone on, what we've actually got is very different perspectives from parents, from adoptees who are still in their 20s, adoptees who are now in their up to 70s.
Totally.
So the range of people included is actually one of the big benefits of the project, I think, that we're coming to now. And lots of different voices have been able to be included.
I totally agree, yeah. And I think both you and I, Hannah, were overwhelmed by the positive uptake from people, how many people wanted to take part in the project.
Yeah, totally. Really overwhelmed. It's always sort of the worry at the beginning stages of a project. Are people going to want to talk to us? And particularly for adult adoptees, they were really keen to share their stories, and we were really grateful of that. And it really has allowed us to answer a lot of our research questions and really get into some in-depth conversations about adoption and names and identity.
And identity was clearly something that people wanted to talk about. I think we weren't sure, because this is the first study in the UK looking at names and identity, for adult adoptees in England and Wales and adopters. We weren't quite sure how many people were going to take part, what some of the concerns might be, and what people might say.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for the adopters as well, we've spoken to people at different stages of adoption, have adopted in recent months, up to people who have adopted many years ago and now have adult children who were adopted many years ago. So the different experiences over time have been really, really interesting to hear, and to compare them with the stories of the adoptees at different stages of their journey as well. So we actually have a lot of very rich data, and Jan, like we say, we were overwhelmed by how much people wanted to share with us.
Yeah, we realised how sensitive it was for people. Obviously, this was something that a lot of people had thought about and reflected about from the very earliest years. And we were asking them once again to reflect on that. And for us, I think it was an emotional journey, our own reactions and our feelings when people were telling us their narratives about their identity, about their namings, and obviously as part of that, their adoption stories. I know you and I, Hannah, have talked about this, that it was a real emotional journey. Everybody's story story was a real privilege to hear, and it was a unique experience to take part in that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, some of the relationships with people who took part were really to a level where when they finished participating in the research, they then actually did get in touch with us at a later point to fill us in on what had happened with their stories. For example, one person had reunited with their birth family in the months after taking part, and they just felt they wanted to update us with what was going on. So it sort of shows the quality of those relationships we were able to develop with our participants that allowed them to enjoy taking part, and also for us to enjoy hearing those stories and be able to retell them and include them in research findings in a very reflective way that accurately tells their story.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think just on from what you said there's kind of two aspects as well that I think came out of the research in terms of reflecting on people's narratives. Just for anyone who doesn't know, the research is in two parts. So the first part was asking people to creatively write their name stories. So they had a booklet in which they would reflect upon names. There was prompts in the booklet to help this, and some snippets from creative writing and poetry. And then within the creative writing exercise, to write a letter as well to somebody without any intention of sending it. And the second part was an interview with which we were then reflected and talked through some of the creative writing as well as other aspects. And I think just thinking of two things here. One, some of the concerns whether we were going to be bringing up things and there was no support available. And the second part is how people got so much out of taking part. So if we just look at the first one about some of the concerns that were raised about people taking part when there was a lack of support available.
Yeah, I think that was something we were very conscious of, is that normally in a research project you would have a support sheet and you would point people in the direction of support should they need it after taking part in research, if it stirred up any negative emotions, they felt they needed any follow-up support. But actually, in terms of the adult adoptees, there isn't a lot of support out there. Some of the organisations are quite small. We didn't want to sort of direct 10 people on one day in the direction of these support agencies. So we were very careful with the agencies and organisations we did point people to. We kept communication open ourselves between us and them if they wanted to talk further. We were really careful that people only took part if they really felt able to. So we did take those concerns on board, and were quite conscious that the people we were talking to best support in the course of their life, dealing with their issues relating to adoption perhaps. But actually what we found is a lot of the adoptees we spoke to did access support in either private, they had to pay for it, or through large adoption organisations and charities. We were surprised actually that people had managed to access it in some cases. So that was something we did ask questions about in reflection to the concerns raised by those in the adult adoption community. So we have sort of looked at that further in relation to what they told us.
Yes, indeed. And as we found out last week, there's been, one of the stumbling blocks for adult adoptees accessing therapeutic support was that each counsellor had to be Ofsted registered. So, far and few between really. But as of last week, there's going to be a change. So the forthcoming change over Ofsted is that adult adoptees will be able to access counsellors. They don't have to be Ofsted registered, which is a great step forward because I know that was a massive stumbling block for a lot of adult adoptees.
Yeah, really great step forward. That was mentioned by quite a few of our adoptees, that they'd either had a delay in access to support because of this rule surrounding Ofsted registration, or that they hadn't been able to access it because of this. So definitely for the people we spoke to, that change in law would have been and will continue to be of benefit to them.
Yeah, totally. And I think we heard from people, our participants, that taking part in this research had a therapeutic aspect to them. We did, I don't know if you want to tell us about a few people that had some words to say about that, Hannah. Maybe we can actually look at their words.
Yeah, definitely. And these come from not only feedback right at the end of taking part in the project, but also, as we said earlier, in future communication that we had by email, by Teams calls to talk to participants after they'd taken part. So at the end of an interview with Eddie, who is one of our adult adoptees, he was reflecting on his experience of taking part in both the creative writing and the interview. And he said, it's not something I talk about a great deal. So yeah, it's cathartic to do so, especially when somebody that's coming at the subject from a very different angle, asking unusual questions I haven't really thought about. The whole study is quite fascinating. So for Eddie, even though over many years he's talked to people about adoption, he had some therapy to deal with issues that had been raised through adoption, he hadn't actually thought about his name or his identity and the role that had played in his experience. So he found it quite cathartic, as he said, to take part. And that is something we heard from both of us heard, didn't we, Jan, from our participants, that they found it a cathartic exercise.
Yeah, definitely. And like you said, just thought-provoking. You know, Eddie, it made him reflect on things in a way he hadn't thought of before. So, you know, he'd reflected on his adoption story and who he is and who he was and who he is, but not necessarily on the name aspect as well. So I think, you know, and Sally as well, another participant, in her booklet, she says the prompts have helped me a lot really think about this thing that we all carry around with us on a daily basis. And by all there, she means adult adoptees. It made me think about why I have struggled to express how I feel about my identity and where we gain our self-esteem. So it's that thought-provoking nature which has come out of the research, which I think is really interesting. Again, Sally later on goes to talk about in her interview that just talking about it and thinking about it has helped, as she puts it, chip off some of the ambiguity. So, you know, the thought processes can get very confusing, she says, but it's helped her to focus and think about identity. So I think that's been really interesting that we've kind of, by putting a spotlight on people's names and identity, it's provided another way of rethinking about their adoption stories and about their identity.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, as we said earlier, we were surprised by how much people wanted to share with us. I think some of the people that took part were actually surprised by how much they had to say. A few people sort of replied and said, I don't know if I've got anything to say about my name, or I'm happy to talk about my adoption, but I don't really have an opinion on my name. But actually, when they came to do the creative writing or the interview or both, they had a lot to say. And an example of that is Paul, who is an adult adoptee again. And he said, it's encouraged me, perhaps, to put pen to paper a little bit more and to process things. I was quite astonished at how much came out and the way in which it came out and the benefits that I got. Although he may not have thought he had much to say on the topic, actually, when he got thinking about it, he found it very beneficial to write, to talk, to think through these issues with us. So that was sort of a common theme that we had from our adoptees. And similarly with our adopters, some of them reflected on how they'd in recent years made decisions surrounding their children's names or even their own names. And they talked about how reflecting on this had almost helped them think through those things or some concerns or some worries that they'd had surrounding those decisions. They'd had time to sit and really think about it and reflect on their own decisions and had found that beneficial to do so.
Yeah, agree. And like Philippa, again, an adult adoptee, sort of says that taking part, as she puts it, a very strong, very powerful reaction. It's an incredibly angry letter, she says, of the letter that she wrote in her creative writing. But she says, I think on the whole, the exercise reflects very accurately how I feel about my name and my adoption. And for the most part, I can be reflective and neutral and okay. And then also I have a deep set rage that wells up and feel so angry about decisions made that changed my life forever. So we can see the complexity there, and the research brought out that complexity, and people did enjoy reflecting on it.
And I think we were very pleased with how people had reacted to taking part in the research and the positive feedback. I don't know if Jan or I were anticipating this, but in future communications with participants after taking part, we found that taking part had actually acted as a catalyst for things that they would then go on to do in the future. For example, get in touch with birth family to ask questions about their name, and members of the family they were already in contact with. They wanted to know more about why their name had been kept the same or been changed or the meaning of their name. And we even had a story from a participant who had actually reverted back to their birth name, their birth surname in recent years, and had gone on to have a tattoo of the coat of arms for their birth surname after taking part in the research, and had said in an email that thinking through these issues had actually confirmed to him this is something that he wanted to do.
Yeah, indeed. So now the research is kind of drawing to a close. It's in its second year, and we're just reading and analysing the amazing stories and booklets that people have generously shared with us. We are still looking for some participants if they want to take part. So far, we've already spoken to 50 people, but we would love to hear from anybody who may be a younger adult adoptee. So if you're between the ages of 18 and 25, we'd love to hear from you. Or if you are an older adopter of adults who are 30 and older, we'd also like to hear from you. And we'll be keeping you up to date with all of the latest analysis and output that will be coming in the forthcoming month. So once again, thanks for listening to the podcast. I hope you enjoyed about our experience of the research of the Names and Adoption study. And it's just a goodbye from Hannah.
Goodbye. Thank you for listening.
And from myself. Thanks very much. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Come back and hear another Name Stories podcast soon.